Actually, before we get started, I just, in terms of tailoring this presentation a little bit, how many people, so I just did by way of raising hands, how many people have heard of ES6? Okay, so that's pretty, so a lot of knowledge, but also some folks who are like, I don't know what that is. How many people have written code in ES6? Okay? And how many people are actively using ES6 as like your production tool in your production projects? Wah, wah, wah. Okay. All right. So, so the presentation tonight is to hopefully move wherever you're at, move a little bit farther along. It sounds like I'm going to not go. We're going to maybe move a little bit quicker through the kind of like what is ES6, but I still want to give some time to make sure folks who haven't heard of it get something out of it. By way of just brief introduction, my name's Hannah. I work for Logical Reality Design. We're a web development contract shop. I've presented here a few times, so some of you guys may be getting a little bored of me. But tonight I want to talk to you about ES6, and I actually more broadly want to talk to you about essentially investing in the future of JavaScript and how to move where we're at today to where we're going. So first of all, ECMAScript 6, or ECMAScript 2015, or Harmony, is the next version of JavaScript. Obviously, you know, a very simple naming scheme there. Essentially, so the term ECMAScript is a term that is used by the standards body that decides on what's going on in JavaScript. And it is a term they use to refer to JavaScript. So essentially what we are talking about here when we say ECMAScript 6 is the next version of JavaScript. Cool? And then it's made slightly more confusing by the fact that they've now renamed it ECMAScript 2015, but everybody already calls it ES6. So anyway, sorry for this starting off with some confusion. So very brief history of JavaScript in the browser. So for those of you guys who are maybe new to web development, the big version of JavaScript that has been around for a long time is ES3. This is essentially the version that was standardized upon, I think, in like very late 90s, and was like the first like fully functional, we're all in agreement, this is JavaScript version of JavaScript. And it was essentially, if you are supporting IE8, this is where you're stuck. So IE8 and before only supported ES3. The next version is ES5, or it sounds like it's the actual next version we're using, but there was an ES4 that was made and then completely dumped by all of the tech companies and never implemented in the browser, mainly because it tried to do a lot of new and exciting things, and Microsoft or some of the other companies were like, yeah, we don't really want to change JavaScript, so we're not going to do it. Or maybe, I also heard that they were afraid that Microsoft was, well, anyway, it's one of those web drama histories you can look up and read about. And so essentially out of that, there was a push for Harmony, and the project Harmony was the attempt to try to reconcile and continue to move JavaScript forward after the disaster that was ES4. So ES5 is probably the version of JavaScript your browser is running today, or specifically ES5.1, though they're basically the same. This added a bunch of really useful things. If you've ever used for each on an array in JavaScript, that is a part of ES5. There are also, if you've used object.create, there's a bunch of other like nice features that came in with ES5 that make JavaScript a little bit more pleasant to program in. And then what's coming up, and what is now actually a working draft standard, is ES6, or specifically ECMAScript 2015. And hopefully your browser will be running it soon. No browsers support ES6 fully yet. But ES6, where ES5 was kind of a like, wow, that ES4 thing was a catastrophe, let's just make a few small changes. ES6 is a big change. There's a lot going on. And moreover, the JavaScript as a language is starting to evolve much quicker, more quickly. So essentially, so you're going to see a lot of changes coming up in the coming years. And I think that hopefully JavaScript's going to get to be a much better language to program in. And eventually, maybe circa 2040, we'll get ES40, and that will be when JavaScript is actually a decent language. So anyway, so these are some things that are coming in JavaScript. Quite a bit. Let me just point out a few of them. Let's see if this will work. So we got classes, right? That's pretty important. We have template strings. This is like actual string interpolation in JavaScript, which is kind of exciting. A big one is modules. JavaScript is finally going to be a programming language. We'll catch up with C, I think, and we'll have a module system. And then let's see, there's a couple other good ones. I can't remember. Oh, decorators are a really interesting feature. I'm going to talk about it a little bit more later. Yeah, and so I'll go over what a few of these things are, but just to see this giant list, it's like one of those lists that like Apple puts up at their keynote when they announce the new iOS, which is like features galore. Anyway, so this is going to be, so this is pretty exciting. So the goals of this presentation is to talk about maybe why you should invest in the future of JavaScript, and how to actually do it. How to practically, if you'd like, invest in future versions of JavaScript in your Angular applications today. So, a few months back, I did a presentation here with my whole company about, actually about Angular 2. And everybody was, we presented on all the new things in Angular 2, and at the time it had all just been announced when they were making no efforts whatsoever to try to like make people feel in any way comfortable about all the changes. So it was just like all this new stuff, and everybody was like coming up afterwards being like, wow, that was so cool. Yeah, I didn't really understand, but it was really cool. You know, and I think that the kind of reaction, because we're programmers and we want to look like we know stuff with this new technologies, I think we're like, whoa, that's cool and futuristic, and I'm so excited. Meanwhile, in the back of our head, we're thinking about all the problems it's going to bring along with it. Like, first, like the fact that it's going to be that, how are we going to use it? And why do I need this? And also, like, why are we just charging ahead into things that are even more poorly supported in the web browser? So, I want to talk about the reasons you want to use future versions of JavaScript, and then I'll talk about how we can overcome some of the problems. So the like easy one is like there are so many things that are much easier to do. There's some really it's like in addition to the big stuff, there's maybe there's hundreds of like little conveniences that move coding in JavaScript out of the dungeons of hell and into more of the sort of modern programming language experience. The other big one, and this is actually where I think, well, the 2 and 4 are the ones that are most important to me. The ES6 is really designed to build applications and/or fulls, or applications, servers, whatever, large-scale stuff in JavaScript. It is a programming language designed for projects that have tens of thousands of lines of code and/or potentially more. The easy one is that Angular 2 is going to prefer ES6. That is the sort of default mode for Angular 2, and so you're essentially getting yourself ready for the upcoming Angular 2 project. For me, I come from a Ruby background. Well, I come from a C++ background technically, but I don't consider it. C++ is like object-oriented programming gone all wrong. So Ruby is the object-oriented programming language I'm most comfortable in. And I don't mean like Rails, I mean like just making classes in Ruby. I find it to be like a super pleasant and like, straightforward experience. So I am a little bit tied into the object-oriented model, but there's definitely a lot of stuff in the new version of JavaScript that makes it feel more like programming in a traditional object-oriented language, and I appreciate that. You can still go back to the functional stuff, but I personally find it much more pleasant to write ES6 code. So what are the problems? I think one of the biggest thing is like, how do I even get started on this? So I know, so off the bat, we know browsers don't support it, and so how am I going to write code in it and have it run, right? And so there's sort of all this tooling out there, and it can be a little bit tricky. It's new stuff. It's not the JavaScript you already know. It's a JavaScript with some changes, and there's that can be a little bit challenging. It is actually, if you're writing Angular code, when you first start, you may find it is actually not that well suited for Angular 1. And in fact, this is something the company I work for, when we started using ES6, we kind of bumped up against, and I'm going to talk about later on in the presentation some of the solutions that we came to. And then there's the people who are like, I hate the fact that all these people want to bring into all these like enterprise-y concepts into JavaScript, and I like JavaScript as this little language that I write functions and jQuery plugins in, and I don't want all this. So this would be a bigger issue if I were in the Angular meetup, but if you're in Angular, you've kind of already bought into more like structured programming to begin with. So that one I'm not going to address as much. If your view is that this is all a bad idea, then that's cool. Maybe we can, I don't know. I don't really have a beer with people, but like we can get a soda together. Anyway, and talk about it. So yeah, and so I'm going to try to address these three things, the top three things. How do I get familiar with ES6? How do I set up my development environment for it? And how do I make it work with Angular 1 in a way that isn't a pain in the butt? So, okay. So these are our three steps. We're going to learn the language. We're going to talk about setting up tooling, and then we're going to talk about integrating with Angular. Repeat of what I just said. So let's start off by learning some ES6. So first of all, if those of you who like classes, who have tried to program them in JavaScript before, this is kind of like the JavaScript's ES5's best attempt at classes. And this is made a little bit even more complicated by the fact that it's actually an inherited class, and that the wall is all weird and warpy and making the text harder to read. So essentially, what you can do if you want to try to create a class in JavaScript, there's this sort of pattern. It's not really a class, but you essentially define a function that's a constructor function. I'm making assumptions about people's sort of like knowledge of sort of programming concepts like constructors and prototypes and whatnot. So from here on out, there is going to be some technical stuff. If you're a beginner, I don't want to leave you out, but also like feel free to ask questions if things don't make sense. This is not a talk app, it's a exchange. So, cool? All right. So there's essentially, so you make this function that builds new versions of the object, and then you define it. Then what you would normally do with like methods in a class, you do with essentially functions on the prototype of the function you just defined. I mean, that totally makes sense to me. So this is like an attempt, and then meanwhile we're also trying to build off of like this is a point 3D object, and we're trying to build off an existing point object. So it's sufficiently complicated that I imagine there are a lot of you who don't even know what this is trying to do if I don't say it, right? So this is what an ES6 class looks like, right? So first of all, it's a class. And like I think like the amount of code just like went from this to yay much, right? So really some really basic stuff. Instead of writing a function that is a constructor that you define attributes of the prototype, you define a class that has a constructor, like classes usually do. And not only that, you can refer to the base class. So you have this point 3D extending point, and it refers to the base class by calling super, right? So that's pretty cool. And then you can continue to reference super in the methods. So the methods are you just define functions in the class, and those are methods. I mean, so there's not much to go over here because this is how methods sort of normally work, right? Cool. Questions? Curiosities? All right. Well, classes are pretty straightforward, or more straightforward. So, very quick digression. Never, ever, ever, ever use eminis. It is a presentation software that is powering this wonderful presentation, but it is a pain to work with. On the upside of all that, sorry, I think this slide was just inserted in a moment where I was like really frustrated. I didn't think about the fact that it's totally not relevant to any of you guys. But in any case, yeah. So don't use this. But the bonus of this is in the process of this, I wrote an app to display gists embedded by giving it a URL. GitHub has something like this, but it doesn't quite work off of a straight URL. So if you ever need to do that, it's on the internet, handagist@herokuapp.com, available for whomever, no authentication, no nothing. Just put in your gist ID, and it will produce a page with the gist embedded on it. So that's what all these guys are right here. Anyway, so modules. So modules are kind of like I think this one's a harder sell because modules are essentially they're adding something, and they're adding something you might feel like you don't need, right? So essentially, the idea of a module, and if you've programmed in sort of other sort of programming languages, this may appear more familiar. In JavaScript, every file, the entire namespace in JavaScript is global. So if you have like an HTML file and you include 10 different JavaScript files in it, then all of those files are in the same namespace. So basically, if you happen to if you want to break an Angular program, you could probably just put a script in there that just said var Angular equals null, and you could probably break an Angular program because they are all the exact same global namespace. So ES6 introduces a traditional module system, which essentially says each file operates in its own namespace, right? So here we've got essentially 3 different files, and it's not maybe a little hard to read. So our top level file is a really simple file. This is like super duper simple version just to kind of get you, get the feel of it. Here we're essentially defining a variable here, and we're exporting that variable, right? And so this is an export default, which means that when I import it in another file, I can actually rename it as I import it to whatever I like. So, and then here we have another file. This one actually has 2 exports of 2 different classes, and that means that those classes. That means that neither one is the default export. So then finally we have our kind of like actual file that uses both of those. And you can see that essentially what it's doing, so it's importing from both of the other 2 files, right? So it's saying, I want the things that those files export. For the one that we gave it a default export, we don't have to do the brackets. And not only that, but I'm just saying import, and I'm renaming whatever it exported to awesomeness, right? And then the other one, I'm importing with brackets, and I'm specifying the thing I want to import. Now you notice I don't actually import both of the things that were exported. I'm saying I just need the Iron Maiden class. So, so essentially, if you were to, at that point, console log awesomeness, so essentially awesomeness was imported from awesome.js, which just exported default export, which we set to awesome. It's going to, awesomeness now is just the string awesome with 3 exclamation marks. Cool? If I were to console log death, which is sorry, these are like really bizarre class names anyway. Yeah. Things that don't seem like a bad idea when you're alone in front of your screen. So anyway, so if I were to console log death, which is the class here, it was exported here, but we didn't import it here, so it's actually undefined, right? So essentially each file is its own little universe, and then and they only appear in other files if you bring them in. So the downside of this is that yes, there's actually a little bit more work involved because you have to say what you want, right? The upside is that you get what you want, and you know that otherwise the rest of your program is off in its own world, right? And so that's really cool in the sense that you can, for large projects, this is really, really important. It makes it much easier to kind of keep keep each file in your program isolated from all the others, so that you can focus just on what you're doing and not have to worry about accidentally overwriting a variable in some other file. In fact, it's sufficiently common that a lot of people actually use this today with some different systems and libraries that are available in ES5. A lot of people use require.js, which is essentially an attempt to implement this system, but in a library as opposed to as a feature of the language. Node.js also has common.js modules, which are another module system. So, so that's the kind of idea with modules. Does anyone have any questions about this? Cool. All right.
So I have a question.
Yes.
So if you have like a index.html page, do you still have to reference each one of these files, or are they like built into like one file or something like that?
Right. So the question of how these modules actually get loaded is one of those it was one of those less clear things about how it's actually going to work in browser. Usually, right now, since we're transpiling usually right now, since we're transpiling ES6, it all gets packed into a single file that you include by your tools. In the future, there are various proposals for exactly how you will import it, but the idea is that you import the top level one and then it would import everything else it needs. So the idea is not to have to then reference each one individually. The idea is that whenever the compiler or whenever the browser engine encounters one of these import statements, it then goes and finds the other module. So that's pretty cool. So you can get your number of JavaScript files included, way down. But I will say that the actual how this is going to get loaded by the browser is a little bit less clear, in part because none of the browsers have actually implemented the modules as a native feature yet. So that's one of the features that is not supported by any of the browsers. Yeah?
So having used like require.js and things like that in the past, one of the things that I couldn't use it for is a lot of times you need a CSS file associated with your JS. Like those things intrinsically go together. You have a collection of directives or whatever. Is there anything in the spec to allow like this module is associated with these CSS files? So if you pull in this, also pull in the styles that go with it?
I mean, you could do that. You could do that with Angular by basically converting your CSS files to JavaScript strings, importing them, and then basically having Angular interpret them into the HTML. I don't believe there is anything in there for the actual browser to use modules with CSS or to import modules from your JavaScript. But I only say that funny thing because I'm actually going to show you some code later that does that with at least templates, with HTML templates. So I think there's some interest. There's definitely possibilities. I don't believe it's part of the spec right now. Yeah.
I can tell you though, you can look at the web components here.
Sure, no,
Yeah. Cool. Yeah, I think web components are probably more on the line of building things that integrate with CSS and stuff. Okay, so let's talk about strings. This is a really simple one, right? If you've ever tried to write a multi-line string in JavaScript, you found that you cannot hit enter without messing up the string. And you've probably also found that if you want to combine a string with a variable with maybe more of a string, instead of just, this is mainly if you're coming from, say, Ruby, you're very used to just, putting in a little character and then interpolating in your variable into the middle of your string, so it's much easier to write. In JavaScript, you do something that looks like adding up of strings. You essentially add things to each other, which actually, if you've programmed in like the days of C and C++, this is just how it always used to be, but it kind of feels not so hot anymore. So anyway, in ES6, they have something called template strings, which essentially are, you just use a different character, you use a little backtick, which admittedly is a little bit weird in terms of the way it looks on your page. It's not as clean as a straight quotation mark. But once you're in the template string, you can interpolate variables with just a little dollar and bracket, and you can go to the next line, and it will continue operating properly. Cool. So that's a really simple one. These are kind of, now I'm getting into some of the oh, thank God they have that now, type features that are really just sort of no-brainers and just make your life a little bit easier. So there's another thing called arrow functions, right? By the way, if those of you who are here for the Angular 2 talk, some of this may be a little bit repeat, but I think there's a lot of new people, and so I want to go over it. So arrow functions, so there's this classic problem in JavaScript, which is that the this, which is supposed to refer to the object you're in at the moment, actually constantly changes and can be very easily manipulated. And so there's, so a classic problem is I define a function, a menu, like a constructor. I'm attempting to implement some kind of a class pattern in old school JavaScript. I define a constructor function. In that constructor function, which takes in a button, I define a handler on that button, and I expect inside of that handler that this is going to refer to the menu to my my menu button object. As it turns out, that's not what happens. This, when any event, JavaScript event gets called, this refers to the window. Or it refers, I can't remember if it's the window or no, but in any case, it's not your object. So, so this there is not going to work. So it's not going to be able to call show menu, the function on the constructor functions prototype. So there actually already is a solution for this, which is that you can call, after you define your function in ES5, this is one of those features that got introduced in ES5, although it was not in ES3. You can call bind, which essentially takes a function and says this function is going to stay attached to this indefinitely. So which is kind of bizarre and looks a little bit weird. And so in ES6 they decided to make a better solution, and then they kind of made that better solution on steroids. So in ES6, this is now class, and what we are doing, we're saying button.onClick, and that right there, that line is a function, right? So essentially, instead of saying, this is kind of a CoffeeScript steal, but instead of saying function, you simply have your parameters followed by a fat arrow, right? And then you define the body of your function. Now, if you are going to have a multi-line function, you have to put brackets around that last part. But that right there is essentially exactly equivalent to that. The button on click function e this show menu dot bind blah blah blah. So, cool. Yeah. I find that this is another one of those it's just more convenient, so much easier, right? So then there's this other thing that isn't really in ES6, but which I'm going to talk about because it's in Angular 2. And it's also coming probably in a future version of JavaScript, most likely ES7, though it might not make it till whatever is after that. So, yeah. But in the meantime, we can all use it through transpilers. So essentially, there's something called a decorator, right? So we've already said that we're going to have classes, right? And classes are super cool, but they're also a little bit heavyweight, right? And sometimes you want to add little bits of functionality to a class without having to actually modify the class, without having to actually subclass it. Or you may, for whatever reason, you may just want to add some kind of metadata to that class. So there's this interesting thing called a decorator. And essentially what you do is you do a little @ sign followed by the name of some kind of function, right? And then you put that right before your class. And what that actually does is it runs that function on your class. And whatever that thing does to your class, it does. Those of you guys who know programming patterns, this pattern's called a decorator, right? You're basically essentially adding a bit of functionality to an existing object and then returning the slightly modified object. Cool. So the interesting thing is this is super useful for dependency injection. And we'll get into that a little bit later. The other thing is, so that's cool. And then the other thing is you can actually have a decorator which takes parameters. So this is an interesting idea of, let's say we want to, have a class and we're going to have a decorator that says whether that class is testable or not, right? So we'll say at is testable, and then we can pass it either true or false. And what that's going to do is call is testable, which is going to return an actual decorator, and then call it on the object, right? Which is a little bit complicated in metaprogramming, but you'll see a little bit how this is cool later. So, cool. Other questions? This one's kind of one of those weird things. Yeah. But you can imagine that if people write cool decorators, they'll be useful. One other thing you can actually do is you can also do decorators on attributes of classes or attributes of objects. So like, let's say you wanted to, rather than having to rewrite a memoization statement every time you define a getter and setter on an object property, let's say you could probably write a sort of meta decorator that essentially just implemented a memoization pattern on a getter and setter. Raise your hand if you know what a memoization pattern is. Okay, cool. So memoization pattern is essentially like set this thing once and then don't keep setting it again, right? So it's instead of so it's like actually apparently I'm not super good at explaining it because I've never had to think about it out loud. But essentially the idea is that a lot of times when you're working with a class or you're working with any other type of object, you want to set an initial value. Basically, you want to be able to call something, and if it has no initial value, set it and give it back. If not, then if it already has an initial value, then just return the value that's already there. So it's sort of like shorthand for this equals this or a new thing. Sorry, now I'm not explaining it well. Essentially, if the value is null, give it a new value. If the value is not null, just return it. So that's a memoization sort of pattern. Somebody who's a more skilled explainer than I can do that. That's very good. But anyway, so those are some features. Those are some cool features. Now you know a little bit about it, and that's like this much introduction. There's a ton of more stuff coming in these new versions of JavaScript. But let's talk about how to actually set it up in your project today. So this is about tooling because, and there used to be a slide here that said essentially all browsers today do not run ES6 out of the box. There's no way to run ES6 in any browser, including Chrome, Firefox, Canary, Beta, whatever. What you have to do is you have to take your ES6 code and run it through a program that converts it back to ES5. And the reason you can actually do that is almost everything in ES6 is actually just what we call syntactic sugar, which is like things that can be written but are a real pain in the butt to write in current JavaScript that are just converted, that are just given much easier ways to write. And we saw that with our example of like the arrow function. You can call .bind, it's just easier to write the arrow. So you run it today through these transpilers, right? And you could say that, well, if I'm transpiling, why don't I just use CoffeeScript, right? Because CoffeeScript is also transpiled to JavaScript. And, obviously you can, that's fine. I don't put a value judgment on that. The arguable advantage of using a new version, using ES6 or ES7, is that this is what JavaScript is going to be eventually. Or at least ES6 is now a working draft of the whatever important body that decides on JavaScript it is. So at some point, your JavaScript, your ES6 JavaScript will run natively in the browser. There will be no transpilation. It will hopefully be super fast. All right, so the Wi-Fi could probably cut out at any time. Cool. All right, so let's say you want to do transpilation. There are a bunch of ways to do it, and each one has its advantages and disadvantages, in my opinion. I'm going to go briefly over these three. Your three main options, I would say at this point, there might be others, are something called Babel.js, Tracer, which is a Google product, and TypeScript, which is a Microsoft product. Essentially, and the sort of like distinguishing things are Babel.js is like it's basically its goal is to transpile JavaScript. Whatever the next version of JavaScript is, it's trying to transpile it back to ES5, not trying to do anything else, right? And I think, honestly, I think it's the easiest from my experience. It's been like because actually the company I work for, we use Tracer. We've used it a lot, and we've had a lot of headaches, I would say, with it. And I personally like Babel is pretty clear. It basically, you npm install it, you run it, it converts things to common.js, which is the node module format. And the advantage, in my opinion, there is that there's this really well-developed program called Browserify for converting node modules into straight, pure, non-modular ES5 that can run in the browser. It's pretty good on source maps. That's one of the big things you're going to care about. And yeah, so I think it's cool. The downside, I guess, would be that it's just JavaScript. You don't get any fancy, crazy new things that are not even on the docket for what JavaScript could look like in the future. And I guess it's supported by the community, which, God, if you don't have a major company behind you, then that's just, who cares? Why would you just do things open source? So anyway, so another option, Tracer. So Tracer is one that's been around a little bit longer. This is Google's thing. And maybe 6 months ago, I would have said this is the path. Because Google's doing it, and Google's huge, and not only that, but they're making Angular 2, and they're using it for Angular 2. As it turns out, Google is not going to use Tracer for Angular 2. They are going to move over to TypeScript, or at least they are in the process of moving over to TypeScript. So Tracer is similarly trying to essentially compile JavaScript plus whatever else Google feels like they want. And my experience, I would say the biggest issue I've had with it is that it changes a lot, and not necessarily in line with the specs that are out there on what these new features of JavaScript are. And so I've had a lot of upgrade minor version of Tracer, everything breaks, right? That does happen sometimes in this world, no matter what, because the specs do change sometimes. So. But yes, and also it's the Tracer team's a little bit hard to connect with and kind of figure out what they're doing. So yeah, so the one bonus of Tracer is that it does have some really good built-in stuff for producing a production version of your JavaScript. So essentially, it will take everything, put it in a single file, and that single file will be already mostly optimized for deploying in a production app. So that's Tracer. The other one, the upcomer, is TypeScript. So TypeScript is actually it's not really an upcomer. TypeScript is actually a Microsoft product, which was originally not necessarily the same as JavaScript, and in fact, it still isn't. They essentially, at some point, Microsoft branched off and said, we're going to make this thing called TypeScript that we're going to use to build a lot of our internal apps. That, among other things, introduced the typing system in JavaScript. And TypeScript, and so they basically built it on their own for a while. And then the Angular team started talking about doing, well, anyway, it doesn't really matter all the kind of back and forth. But essentially, at some point, the Angular team started angling towards TypeScript because they were really into having a typing system in Angular 2. And now TypeScript is going to catch up with JavaScript and all of its new features, and then it will be another way to transpile. I don't think this one's really ready because the ES6 full compatible version is not out of beta. So I don't know if that would, if you want to use the, the beta, alpha, whatever version, you can. So questions about this? This is probably, there's a lot out there. It's a little bit complicated, Yeah.
Has Google made it public that they're going away from Tracer? Have they fully embraced that?
I mean, they said I don't know, they have these conferences and they say stuff at these conferences and it seems like it's somebody is giving a presentation, they make an offhand remark that they're oh, I think we'll just go over to TypeScript, but that's exactly what they said. Now, in the source code, because I've been kind of following along because I'm weirdly obsessed with it, like they are making a transition in the source code of Angular 2. So that's what it seems like. Also because they're trying to compile Dart as well, so yeah.
Is tracer at script?
Yes. That's another one. So AtScript is no longer exists. AtScript was yes, that's what Tracer did compile, but AtScript was a Google proposal for a bunch of additions to JavaScript that they eventually said, you know what, we're just going to use TypeScript. So they essentially there was essentially one or two features that they proposed that weren't in TypeScript, and then TypeScript was like, we'll just add those. And so they now, AtScript and TypeScript have merged, it is just called TypeScript. The thing that's a little confusing is that one of the big features of AtScript, the at was the little at symbol, and it stood for annotations. So annotations was what I was talking about earlier, called decorators, but they have not, but the ES body, it's called TC39, has now moved to probably just doing decorators as the thing you add with the little at symbol, which they operate slightly different. And another thing you only can see if you follow along in the source code of Angular 2, they have actually switched now to using decorators, not annotations. So a lot of not very, you probably, hopefully will not be writing decorators that often, you'll be using them. So hopefully how they're actually implemented will not be that important. But Tracer works, and I've thrown a fair amount of energy into making it work well in a production environment in my professional life, but I do not think it is a great solution personally, but that's my opinion. Ask someone else, so, yeah. Cool? Yeah?
A little bit about that. I was just at the Microsoft Code Conference, and the Angular team was there. And they had this presented with Microsoft and talked about why they moved over to TypeScript. And they worked together to merge annotations and AtScript. It just made a lot more sense. And we use TypeScript with Angular just to get, we're good about it. Our big project for us is the type development.
Right.
In the JavaScript.
Yeah.
Not that big.
Yeah.
But, I will just say type it's an optimal typing system. For every project you want strong typing to catch bugs earlier. Its purpose is to match the JavaScript standards file.
Right.
And by the way, the standards file, they're moving to releasing other standards on a yearly basis.
Yeah, and that's why they're changing the naming scheme.
And they're also they're treating JavaScript more of an assembly for the web.
Right.
Assembly language means that it's really meant for these other libraries to run on top of it. So learning, that's why Babel, TypeScript, for sure.
Yeah.
It makes sense. Actually, that will change their name from ES6 to Babel because it wasn't just an ES6 transfer. They're here for the long run, and I think these tools are going to be moving faster than the standard. So we're probably all going to be stuck
with one or the other, yeah. So I recommend Babel because I found a really easy way to use it, which is use Browserify and then install this transform called Babelify. And it's after having spent months trying to get Tracer to work, eventually succeeding, but amount of time invested, I tried Babel and it was I had something working in an hour, which was super cool. So if you're using Browserify already, which you may be, then all you have to do is install the transform Babelify, and you can simply just start writing ES6 code and using ES6's module system instead of the Node module system. So super easy, or at least I think that's the easiest ones. Just some things to keep in mind in your decision. Figuring out source maps are super important because the generated code is sometimes pretty ugly looking. Module, how you're gonna make sure that the module paths get resolved correctly, so you're not, make sure that when you're importing something, it refers to the right file. Obviously, making sure that you can bundle in some way in production, so it's not super slow. And just keep an eye out that most of these require some kind of polyfill library to be included at the top of your files. So, cool. All right, so I realize that we're going a little bit long, so I want to try to speed up a wee bit and get into a little bit about Angular with ES6. So this is some just really basic Angular file, right? There's, you define, these are two different Angular files. You've got maybe, an app module and a service module. Service module defines the service. App module defines the controller, just as hypothetical. And you want to convert it to ES6. So you do something like this, which if you look at it closely, all I've done is add code. It feels like, wow, that didn't really accomplish much. I just have to do all my explicit imports and I've got the exact same code. Now I didn't do any attempt to clean this up using ES6's features right now, so this is kind of a worst case scenario, right? So here we're explicitly importing Angular. Now, admittedly, that would not be in the HTML anymore. I don't have to, put a script tag for Angular. I'm importing it in both places. I'm exporting the module. I didn't even actually, I don't need to export it. Yeah. So anyway, the reason this is all funky, and this is sort of a little known fact, Angular 1, the whole module system and dependency injection is essentially, it's a workaround for the fact that there was no module system. Right? The Angular module system is a workaround for the fact that there was no JavaScript module system. And so essentially, there's a lot of sort of, work that's being duplicated when you use Angular 1 and ES6 together. So how do you make that not so bad? So one thing you might say is, all right, well, I have a module system. So instead, so I don't need to use Angular's module system so much. So instead of defining a separate module for my service, I'll just define it in another JavaScript module. I'll export it from that JavaScript module, and I'll import it into my top-level module and just throw it in there at the end as a service, right? So this looks a little bit better. We've gone ahead and converted the service to a class, it's definitely probably an improvement, right? And we just have one chunk of lots of Angular syntax. And we no longer have to import Angular down here at the bottom. So that's maybe an improvement, right? So what's the downside? That code, as it's written, will break on minification, including even with ng-annotate. I learned this through experience. So So one of the big challenges with minification is that if you aren't doing explicit dependency injection, hopefully those terms all make sense together, then when you minify things, it will break, and you can use these little things that try to throw in the explicit dependency injection, but sometimes they don't work, particularly when you're using a module system. So you might fix it by doing the same thing, but I don't know if you all know you can set a $inject property on something. And that is essentially a way of doing explicit dependency injection. So that's kind of that's a workaround. This will work. This class down here still looks okay. This is looking a little bit. This is still very Angular-y and weird. So could we do better, right? All right. So now I'm getting to the part of the presentation where I'm going to talk about my own tool, which is. So essentially, can we write ES6 in Angular 1 in a way that's more effective? And can we actually get ourselves ready for Angular 2 by using syntax that's like Angular 2? So this is my own tool. It's called A1AppScript. The rest of the presentation is a little bit about this. And I don't normally self-promote my own tools, except I think this one's actually decent. So anyway, that's the GitHub, that's the thing. Sorry for the name, I didn't know that Google was going to just throw out AppScript, so it's called A1AppScript for back when AppScript was a thing, and now I need to rename my little gem that, anyway. So here's your app module in A1AppScript, right? Converted the controller to a class, and I just have a couple of decorators, right? I've decorated it with a controller decorator. I'm throwing up my explicit dependency injection up there, so I don't even have to worry about using ng-annotate. I'm importing my service, and then I'm also just in this case I'm saying that this controller should be thrown into a module, right? and this will, so that simple syntax will get converted into an Angular module. And you can see that it's interesting, I'm just, in the module annotation, I'm just throwing in the service as one of the components of that module. And A1AppScript will convert all of that to an Angular module declaration. My service, meanwhile, looks pretty straightforward. I've just got a service annotation at the top of it that tells Angular that tells A1AppScript that it's a service, and will set when it eventually sets up the module, it'll set it up properly to work with to work as a service. Cool. So that's sort of like the basics. The things that I think are really cool about it is it's very like Angular 2. It does make code that's much more readable. The other thing that's nice is it's really easy to test because all these annotations are just annotations until you run the injector. So you can just test the classes as pure JavaScript classes, which makes them super easy to test. Particularly if you're using some, we ended up writing something like this for UE Router, and UE Router trying to test it off the bat was really, really tough, and this made it a lot easier. And the other thing is it has components. So components, what do you mean by components? So I guess I'm now narrating the audience for my own presentation, I apologize for that. So you mean like directives, right? Like Angular 1 directives, like that mess, right? So that's an Angular 1 directive. Admittedly, it's a pretty complicated directive, but you have to know things like, so the directive definition API is like a whole hot mess of like, like remembering what restrict attribute to put on a directive, and I don't know, all of this stuff to get a directive to work, right? So, no, I actually mean something like this. So this is actually the Angular 2 component API for the most part. We're specifying, instead of specifying a restrict property, we're just specifying a CSS selector. We're giving, instead of doing that bizarre scope syntax with the, am I getting a pure JavaScript value, or am I binding to a string, or am I binding to a property? We just have a properties. We say what we want to inject into it. We have our we have a view where we specify a template, and then we just define a class to set up for anything else that would essentially fill in where the link function and the controller function would go in a directive definition object. So this is actually the Angular 2 API for the most part, and A1AppScript will let you run this in Angular 1 today. So, so that's pretty cool. Except there's more. This is the last feature, then we'll wrap this up. So it actually, A1AppScript now works with the new router. So you can actually define routable components the way that Angular 2 does, right? So I'm essentially defining here, I'm just defining two components, an app component with a template, an app, a selector of, basically bind onto the awesome element. When I say CSS selectors, what I mean is if I wanted this directive to work on an attribute, I would just put square brackets around it, so that it would essentially bind to an attribute as opposed to an element. And then I just add a route config annotation, and in my template for app, I would want to put an ng viewport directive, which will essentially pop in a subcomponent, and then I just specify my subcomponent, and then I define my subcomponent up there. Cool. Sorry, I realized that was super fast. Anyone have any questions? Yeah, so that's what you can do with it, and then we actually use this in our production code today. So it's pretty neat.
Do they pay you for it?
What? No, I developed this on my own time because I was open source. What a joke. Anyway, it is open source, but yeah, I developed it on my own time because I'd never written an open source anything, so I wanted to try to have something that I wrote. So anyway, but we now use it. Right, but obviously there's all this, you got ES6 tooling and all this other stuff, and so it's hard to set up. Well, there's a really easy starter repo that's up on the internet. It's pretty full featured. It's just sort of it's based off of the Gulp starter repo, and you can just you can download this and start building your project from it. And I'm just going to wrap up with some really brief, just showing you that the code actually works, and then I'll move off because I know I've gone over my time limit already. So let me just briefly show you a couple of things. So, okay, so there's my code. Let me go ahead and I'm just going to go. So this is the this is just the basic repo. You've got stuff in source app. All we have right now is an app.js. We are defining just an app component, right? And we're saying it's going to bind to the element app. Where the one thing you call at the end is bootstrap, which basically runs all the thing to convert this to Angular 1, and then which is also the Angular 2 command you run to start your application. And then our template is like super duper simple, right? We just have an ng app directive and an app component, and that's sort of going to be our top level component, right? So pretty straightforward. You can see that we have a single JavaScript include, so there's not a long list of things at the bottom. Really briefly, I'll just go ahead and, so I'm going to go ahead and, do I have this running? Let's just go ahead and do this. So, is it running yet? Let's try it. There we go. All right, so all this does is right now, the template for this component is just the word awesome in a p tag, so that's it. So I'm going to go ahead and just briefly update it a little bit. So I'm not really going to code this. I'm actually going to go to previous Git steps that I've done. So the first thing I did is really simple. I just wanted to add Angular material in, so I threw it in here as an import. And then you can see if I, actually it should refresh automatically, but I'm not sure why it didn't refresh automatically. Fetch, oh well. Or maybe you just can't see it on here. Oh, CSS is not automatic, so. So anyway, let's refresh. Okay, all right, so that's all just styling changes, nothing exciting. And I'm gonna go ahead and do, all right, so now this is an actual app, and this is a very, this version is the very poorly written one where I literally put everything in a single file, right? And you can see though that interestingly, because JavaScript has template strings, I can actually put my HTML templates into the file and just and essentially have them in line. So here, this is a really simple app. It is a list of frozen yogurts, which is a demo that I've used in a lot of cases in any case. So it's a very simple thing that's just a list of frozen yogurts. I have a little service to list my frozen yogurts. I didn't finish like actually building this and connecting it to the web. But you can see over in our app, we now have like an actual app with some lists, and you can see that it actually routes, right? So I'm switching between different routes, and the router is handling that, and that's coming from these little route configs here, where I just have a root route and an ID route. And these are all, so I have, right now I have the top level app component, I have a service, I have a Froyo list, and I have a Froyo detail, right? So pretty simple, but really simple. This is all running with Angular 1. And then I'm going to just do, then the only other change that I'm going to do right now, just to show you that it works, is I could put things in other files so that I have a nice clean top level file. And then I'm importing the other stuff from other files. One cool thing, since I'm using Browserify, I can just use Browserify to take HTML files and convert them to JavaScript strings. So I can just import my HTML and just specify it here. I could do a template URL and use, some HTML to JS thing to kind of like compile all my app templates. But I find this is super useful because the interesting thing is I could take this whole component and move it. There are no paths in here that are not relative. So I could move it to a different part of the app, or I could pull it out and use it in another app, and so that would be super cool. or that's something that comes up a lot for us in terms of our production stuff. So that is, I believe, finally, I know that was super long, about it in terms of what I've got. Yeah, that's so. I will put up the slide URL on the meeting notes. And if you have any questions, feel free to ask them now or after the meeting. So I know I've gone over my time, so I don't want to keep my presenter.